All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another week of SaberSim's strategy sessions. We've been doing these here for getting close to about 2 months. Once a week, we hop on live here and talk about a specific sport or contest type or DFS strategy or topic area, whatever we really feel is relevant for that week and whatever we've been getting a lot of questions on. So with MLB returning here tomorrow, finally, if you're anything like me, it's been a nice 3 days break, but ready to dive back in. We do have one single game showdown tomorrow night between the Yankees and Red Sox. So we figured no better time than to talk a little bit of MLB showdowns here today. So excited to talk about that. The last 3 weeks, we've been hitting the baseball content really hard here in the middle of summer. So 3 weeks ago, we had Matt and Will on talking about the baseball model, some of the improvements we've been making this season, everything going on there with the model. And then the last 2 weeks, I've been joined by Max, and we've just really been talking about baseball process overall. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about 5 strategies or styles of winning players, of ways that you can add value to your MLB DFS process. And last week, we had a video called Finding the Right Stacks in MLB DFS, a way of using SaberSim as a research tool rather than just a lineup builder, of course, to identify potential stacks that maybe have high upside at lower ownership. So the links for all 3 of those videos will be in the description of this video once it is posted as a recording here. I highly recommend checking those out if you've been playing baseball DFS. The one other strategy session that I would plug here before we go ahead and get started, earlier in the summer here, we did one for basketball, NBA showdowns. And obviously there's a big difference between those two sports, but I do think showdown contests and DFS have more in common with each other than they have different. So if you're playing showdowns, especially if you're still playing a little bit of basketball showdown, always good to go back and review that video. But I've got Chris here joining me today. If you've been around in our Slack community or happened to watch a specific office hours episode of last week, you'll be familiar with Chris. But I know Chris plays a lot of MLB showdowns, pretty savvy with that contest type overall. Chris, how are you doing?
Doing well. Yeah, I'm definitely an MLB Showdown junkie. I'll play basically every slate that they have, and thankfully there's a lot of them.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, well, I'm excited to talk through it a little bit today here with you. Last thing I'll note before we go ahead and get started is that we host these shows live for a reason. So we want engagement from you guys. We want questions. If Chris and I are really riffing here and you're sitting there thinking, what the hell are these guys talking about? Hopefully you don't. But if you do, pop a question into chat, either YouTube chat or the Office Hours channel on Slack. We want to make sure that you guys are getting something out of this. We want you guys to be a part of the conversation. So if you have something to add, you want to add your 2 cents or offer something up, we'll pull it up on screen. We'll talk about it a little bit. So anyway, I guess we will go ahead and get started here. We've got plenty to talk about. We've been trying to approach these strategy sessions here from the lens of giving you guys a few takeaways that we'll mention here at the start of the stream and then circle back on at the end of the stream. And we want to make sure these are some of the things that you really kind of leave the show with. So the first of that is to let Smart Diversity do some of the hard work for you. The way Smart Diversity works, and we'll get to this in a bit more detail here, especially at really high levels, is using single game simulations to determine projections for each player before we put them in a lineup. That's perfect for Showdown, right? They're playing this one single game one time. Building lineups through that way is a great way to get some edge. The second is to find a way to get different with your lineup construction overall. There's a lot of ways to do that, but a lot of the edge in these contests is baked into not getting duplicated and building a unique lineup. So we'll talk about a few ways to do that. And then the third is to use some of the sound contest selection principles and bankroll management principles that we've talked about here before to weather the extreme variance that comes with these kinds of contests. We'll talk about what that means a little bit more for MLB Showdown specifically here as we get into this, but it's always important to remember that point. But Chris, I think a great way for us to get started here is maybe if you just want to dive into your overall approach or your general strategy, or where you find that SaberSim has some of the edge in building these MLB Showdown lineups.
Sure. So definitely Smart Diversity and Showdown are just like a match made in heaven. So even without doing a whole lot of your own adjustments or research, I think just some small tweaks and some patience, like this is definitely a game format that you can have success with. my strategy and the reason that kind of like I spend so much time on Showdown is just that there are so many slates. And so you can really design a process that lets you consistently play them with the same way, make small tweaks, improve your process over time, and really like find that edge and refine your process. So a lot of the other slates and game modes, you know, they change on a daily basis. They rotate through different size slates, different size contests. Showdown is much more consistent than that. So if you have the mentality that you like to dial in a process, focus on improvement, and create a repeatable strategy to play DFS, I think MLB Showdown is a great place to focus.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that is nice about baseball in general is that you've got a slate every day along with basketball and hockey and a few other sports, but pretty much have a slate every day. So you can refine that process pretty quickly and draw conclusions about your results fairly quickly compared to something like football or golf or anything like that. But showdowns, we've typically got anywhere from 3 to 7 sometimes on some of these big days. Plenty of contests to play, and of course some bigger contests here tomorrow, which should be a lot of fun. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my screen here, get the app going, just to help kind of walk through some things here. So I do have tomorrow's Red Sox Yankees game pulled up here. And I think the smart diversity point is just huge here. I think it's a point worth staying on for a bit. You'll see that for our default sliders for, I'm going to say very nearly almost every single contest type that you could realistically play, you're going to have a smart diversity of at least 9, generally 10, right? And applying some of the same concepts that we were thinking about here from last week when we were talking with Max, when we have smart diversity that high, what we are doing is we are very nearly approaching lineups that are mathematical optimals for a single game simulation, right? And that's where I think the value of SaberSim compared to a traditional optimizer starts to add a lot of edge to your showdown lineups, right? When we look at a hitter, especially their real ranges of outcomes, guy like Aaron Judge, right, has sky high ceiling, or any of these big hitters here at the top. The pitchers and things like that are typically going to grade out very well point per dollar. A traditional optimizer isn't going to be really well equipped to deal with the player's real ranges of outcomes and ceiling potential in the same way that SaberSim is, because we're using our simulation data to determine the projections for players and then using a high smart diversity slider to use very small or single game simulations for building these lineups. You get optimal lineups that can play out in ways that are somewhat unpredictable and other optimizers will struggle to build. I think one thing that's important to remember as you're building your MLB Showdown lineups is baseball is a variant, weird game. And we talked about basketball showdowns here a couple weeks ago. And I think this is one point maybe where I will say there's some difference between basketball and baseball showdowns. In the basketball video, we talked about thinking about a narrative that accompanies your lineup. In baseball, in a lot of ways, I sometimes think that can be thrown out of the window, right? You can do a little bit of trusting the simulation here that when we're running a build at 10 smart diversity and we get a lineup that maybe looks a little bit strange, maybe you've got a captain lineup where you're playing Rodriguez and you've got 4 Yankees bats on the other side, right? Those lineups come up. Those lineups are unique, and those lineups can be often optimal. Those are lineups that other players using traditional optimizers may not get as much access to, but there's a real associated game simulation where that lineup's optimal. And that is kind of where I think a lot of the value of smart diversity shines, why it can be so useful as a tool to help build these lineups. So
yeah, I think when you get into those lineups where it's into the roster construction territory where other people will start to shy away from that because of kind of the rules-based logic they're using to build their lineups. What SaberSim is telling you is that in a simulation, that lineup is still viable and still has a chance to win. And that's kind of the sweet spot. When you get those lineups that still, have that upside and can project pretty well, but other people are maybe going to shy away from that because of these heuristics that they're using in their approach, that's kind of a big edge that SaberSim provides.
Right. Absolutely. And I think something that you and I, Chris, were talking about here before the stream, I think what's really useful about this is that we avoid those heuristics and we can handle some of this on a slate to slate basis, right? It's not going to make sense to use the same heuristics on every MLB Showdown lineup. You wouldn't want to necessarily use a traditional optimizer and say, I always want to 4-2 stack or something like that, or I always want to 5-1 stack, or always want 3-3, right? Those are the only tools that really are going to be available on a traditional optimizer. Whereas on SaberSim, we're using those real game simulations. We build lineups from a wide range of different constructions based on what really works out and what is optimal for that given slate. So there's a lot of value there. I think as we're kind of getting into this roster construction side of things, I think it's a good bridge to that next overall point here of thinking about how to get different on the field. So I guess as a good starting point here, Chris, I mean, is this something that you're kind of often thinking about as you approach your MLB Showdown lineups, the concern of duplication and ways that we can avoid that?
It depends a lot on the slate and the size of contests being offered. A lot of Showdown slates are on the small side just because there are other sports going on. There's MLB main slate or other standard game formats that are more popular. And so in those cases where the Showdown is definitely the secondary slate at that time that's being offered, I don't worry too much about forcing the issue when it comes to getting unique. I think SaberSim kind of does that well already with smart diversity. As the contests get larger, like for instance, the contest Thursday night with the game between the Red Sox and the Yankees, then I think it becomes more of a concern because in a situation like that where the contests are many times larger, any lineup that projects well and also has kind of correlation characteristics that fit kind of the heuristics that people use to build their lineups is probably going to be duped many, many times as long as it projects well. And so for those large contests, then you want to start thinking more about how are you going to differentiate with either your exposure to popular players, you know, chalk versus contrarian, what kind of salary settings you can use. Do you want to think about using relievers or pinch hitters, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great point. Looking at, we ran a build here right before we got started here. So this was a test build, not even built for a very big contest overall, looking at like a 20 max for 1,000 to 10,000 people here. I think one of those highest leverage spots, obviously, on the lineup is that captain position. And it's a position where the field in general, I think, overly gravitates towards the starting pitchers, mostly because they are typically projected as the highest point scorers on the slate. Somebody optimizing for just a general, even a ceiling projection, not even a medium projection, is going to get a ton of pitchers in their captain spot. They also typically grade out really well point per dollar, right? But what we're seeing here when we run our build is we actually, again, on a slate to slate basis, there are games, there are showdowns where you've got two aces going at another. Your two captains are going to be vastly those two pitchers. But you see, we already start getting a very even percentage of different options at captains where it's that player we're trying to find that has the ceiling outcome game, right? Even as we see on our projections, right, that these two pitchers at the top are the highest raw projection players. They're the highest, or they're typically very high value players as well, especially when considering those projections. When you start to look at the game outcomes where those players hit ceilings, you see this condensing effect, right? And we've talked about this a lot on stream before too, where the players condense at the ceiling outcomes that you need them to hit to win the contest anyway. It implies that maybe sometimes those pitchers aren't necessarily the most optimal way to construct your lineups. There's a very easy path to leverage on the field by looking at lineups that don't necessarily roster a starting pitcher, especially if the builder is saying to you that it's viable. Right? Coming full circle here, thinking about some of the concepts we've been talking about in the past few weeks. When you run a build at 10 smart diversity, you're getting an opportunity to think about what is viable on the slate. And we are getting an indication here from the builder that going a different direction and avoiding some of those pitcher captain lineups in at least 45% of our lineups here makes a lot of sense. I think there's already a lot of leverage that you can find on the field there. There is a question that came in here, and I think it leads into another way that we can differentiate in our lineups pretty well. But Sheets said, first of all, for those who don't know, Chris is one of the more helpful experts from the Slack channel. He said, I have a question. Even with high smart diversity settings, do you ever hand force uniqueness by using max salary settings? Chris, do you have any thoughts on that first here? And then I'll kind of follow up.
Yeah, again, it kind of depends on the slate. So for the typical showdown slate that you see on a standard MLB during the regular season, standard regular season day, I don't really worry about it. I think, again, smart diversity handles that well enough relative to the size of the contests. For a slate like tomorrow's, I think that's a great way that you can kind of differentiate yourself. And I think in general, people just kind of like lower it, 1 to 200 and like call it good. But I think there's some nuance you can apply to that. If you go to the projections and you look at the salaries and you kind of go down the list and you can see players that are projected within, 1 or 2 points of each other, but maybe have, $1,000 to $2,000 difference in salary. If you think about like the point of lowering the max salary is to increase the chance of getting a unique lineup. Well, you increase the chance of getting a unique lineup by playing a cheaper player that projects for slightly less than a more expensive player. And so you can force that in more of your lineups by looking at the difference between those that most highly projected batter. Like you could see Aaron Judge is projected for 9,800. Stanton and Voit, Voit is projected, his salary is 7,200. He's projected for 1.2-ish fewer points. If you wanted to get very contrarian, you could lower your salary by the difference, your max salary by the difference between those two players. So when SaberSim is building lineups for you, you're going to end up with a lot of lineups where you could fit somebody like Aaron Judge, but instead it's going to automatically put in someone like Voit or Stanton. And those lineups are going to be duplicated way fewer, than a lineup that fits the most expensive player in or uses the max salary.
That's a really savvy point. I've never thought about approaching the max salary in that way, but yeah, you'll get access to constructions that are very unique there and leave a lot of salary on the table. I think that applies to other sports too. Like I've used that approach for NBA and NFL. Like you can think about any slate with the Bucks with like Giannis and Middleton, like for this current series, you can think about the same thing. Like what's the difference in salary between Middleton and Giannis? And then you could lower the max salary so that you are favoring Middleton when you could fit Giannis. And those lineups, again, are just going to they have a much higher chance of being unique. Yeah, and I think the point of emphasis there is that when we look at something like the 85th percentile, which is the kind of score we need to win one of these contests, something on the ceiling side, maybe not so as extreme as 95th, but maybe 85th percentile. When you're looking at the average projection, you can say, well, man, I'm giving up almost 15% of my point value by building a construction like that. This is what I mean when I say that the difference between these players condenses and disappears as you approach those ceiling values. When we look at an 85th percentile outcome, we see that Judge is a mere point higher projected than Voit, right? They have essentially the same 85th percentile outcome. And you get access to these wildly different lineup constructions, these very unlikely to be duplicated lineups, by sacrificing very little ceiling, actually, overall, between those two players.
Totally. In baseball, I think that it has a lot of merit just because of that variance. And for basketball, that's probably less of a case. And, there's sort of in between, there's the whole spectrum for sports. But for baseball, I think with the variance, especially on these huge slates with, 15,000 plus entrants, it makes a lot of sense to emphasize that effort to be unique a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is a little bit of a scale. We have one other thing that we were going to talk about here as a way to get unique. We'll get there in a second. But the last note on thinking about salary, I think salary is a very easy to apply one size fits all solution in the builder. If you don't already know, you can edit this max salary field here and drop down to maybe even by 1,000 or what say you, to lower the max salary of all the lineups we build. One way I like to use this is to treat it in conjunction with the way I'm viewing this slate overall. So there are many different ways to get leverage here on a showdown slate. I think one of them is doing something a little bit different at captain, primarily by avoiding the starting pitchers, who are typically the two chalkiest captains. Secondarily, by adding a relief pitcher, which we'll talk about here more in a moment. But if you're finding that the builder doesn't want to do those things, maybe you've got two great aces up top. The builder wants to use them as a lot of captains. You're not getting a lot of access to relief pitchers or other low-owned players, guys hitting lower in the order. You're worried that the optimal lineups that the builder is spitting out of the gate look a little too chalky, look a little under-leveraged for the contest you're playing. I think at that point, a really good way then to apply a blanket form of leverage across your whole pool of lineups is to then start using some salary restrictions, right? I think if you were already building very unique lineups that used hitters at captains here and used a lot of relief pitchers or things like that, I don't know if you necessarily need to add in that additional leverage on the field in terms of salary, but I like to use it typically when I'm finding it difficult to get different elsewhere. So cool. So I mentioned one of the other things we wanted to talk about here, and that was relief pitchers. So one thing you will notice that is particularly fairly unique to SaberSim, at least as far as I am aware, is we do project relief pitchers here. You are likely to get some in your lineups in general. I don't think we got any in this test build, but I know Chris ran a bigger build before our show here and got a few in. But you'll see some relief pitchers in your showdown lineups. And what is really awesome about this here is that these are not raw projections. These are simulation-driven projections, just like the rest of our sims. And you can see we've got real ranges of outcomes for these relief pitchers when they come in the game and get a couple strikeouts or knock out an inning or whatever. They are real players. Easy to forget if you are primarily more of a MLB DFS fan than an MLB fan. But there's a lot of value in rostering some of these players. So I think there's a couple different ways to tackle this conversation here. I think the most important thing, or maybe not the most important thing, but one of the things that can be very useful about using relievers in your lineup is that they provide a form of leverage in the form of opportunity cost against some of the lowest salary players in the lineup, right? When we look at players like Tim LeCastro and Bobby Dalbec, guys that are min price, the same price as these min pitchers, if you click on these players, you're going to see that their most common outcome is scoring 0, right? It happens often, 21% of the time here for LeCastro. They may score 3 points, 18% of the time, right? These very low scoring outcomes, these floor outcomes are very possible. What you are doing in part by rostering a relief pitcher is you are providing a situation where if that pitcher even really gets in the game, which happens more often than I think people think too, our best projected reliever is expected to come in, it looks like in some form here, one way or the other, about 75% of the time. And then you're looking for him to score points of any kind and replace the 0 for players that rostered the much safer player like LeCastro or Dalbec, who proceeded to go 0 for 4, right? You get a very unique lineup. You get a lineup that is very well leveraged on the field by matching a construction, very similar to what we talked about before, right? Building a construction that maybe has enough salary for someone like Aaron Judge, but you play Voit, sacrifice very little ceiling, and get an extremely leveraged lineup. The same principles apply here, I think, on some of the relievers. You get access to a minimum salary player here that replaces a player that has a very low floor that happens in the plurality of their simulations, right? Chris, any thoughts on that here before I kind of talk about some of the other points I wanted to make about relievers?
Yeah, I think SaberSim, this is like one of the places where SaberSim has a lot of edge over people that are building in a rules or heuristics-based way, and that it can intelligently include relievers in your lineups without sacrificing too much. Whereas if people are just blindly forcing them in, they're gonna maybe be trading it off in a way that's not, intelligent. So when, like, your exposure to relievers is going to vary a lot depending on the slate. And that's why it's hard to include them in your lineups when you're building with heuristics or rules. So on a slate like tomorrow's, where both teams are projected for well over 4 runs, and there's also a lot of cheap hitters, your exposures to relievers are naturally going to be lower. But if you had a slate with a couple of like stud pitchers, and both teams were projected for a total in the 3s, and there's only 1 or 2 hitters in that 4K range, you can get a lot more exposure to relievers in a way that also gives you well projected unique lineups. And so those are slates where Smart Diversity and SaberSim like really shine.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I think the one other thing that can be very useful, I think part of the reason that we are not getting so many relievers when you run builds for tomorrow's game is actually because we have some of these min salary hitters in the lineup that Chris mentioned. On slates where you do not, where hitters 1 through 9 in the order, or 1 through 8 or something like that, are all 5K or above, you also give yourself an opportunity to build unique lineup constructions by pairing hitters together that would be difficult to otherwise, or impossible to otherwise, play together. It's very easy to build lineup constructions that maybe feature 2 or 3 of the best hitters playing in the game. That would be very salary intensive with a traditional lineup built with just hitters. By leaking in a reliever, you get access to lineup constructions that, again, are rare for that particular game, that particular contest. You are very low. The odds of being duplicated with some of these lineups are very low.
Totally. Yeah.
I think, go ahead.
Oh, the salary, when, like you were saying, when there are batters with a comparable salary, and more than one in this case, then your exposure to relievers is going to be lower. But that also, if you go with those relievers, it also gives you more leverage. And DraftKings changed the format, I think, last season, where they made it so that relievers and the cheapest batters, the min price or the min salary was the same. It used to be so that relievers were actually 1,000 cheaper than even the cheapest batters, which, if you applied some salary rules in kind of like a nuanced way, you could have a huge edge in roster construction, where rostering relievers who were projected to, probably still, get an opportunity, unlocked unique roster construction with your batters that still projected very well. And so that was actually kind of what got me into Showdown in the first place, was realizing that edge in salary and exposure to relievers. Unfortunately, they changed that, so I can no longer apply it, but I have kept going.
Yeah, I think that is a little bit of unfortunate lost edge there. I remember that as well. But we did get another question here from Sheets. I think it eases us into the next point here really well. He said, if a reliever pitched the night before, I would think that SS set to a high Smart Diversity setting might get tricked into using them, even if they never pitch back-to-back. Any chance simulations are that smart? That's a great point. At the moment, the baseball model isn't taking into account relievers' pitch history, whether they pitched the night before. I think that is one spot that you can really add a lot of value to your process overall. So one thing I like to use here, I've mentioned it before on office hours, I think it's a pretty useful tool, is I use this baseballpress.com bullpen usage page. I just think it's very clean, very, very simple. And very clear way. Say how many pitchers the player has thrown in the last 5 days. I think there's a few different ways you can use this. The way I personally like to go about it is I will relieve pitchers from my pool that pitched the day prior. I think that's, again, on a day where you're maybe playing 5, 6, 7 of these. I think that's the easiest way to add some value while still keeping things simple. I will often keep closers in. Even if they've pitched the day before, I think they are a bit more likely in general to pitch in consecutive days. If you see a player that clearly the team is allowing in general to pitch multiple days in a row, maybe someone like Steve Cishek for the Angels, if the Angels were playing, that's clearly a player that has some history pitching multiple days in a row, I think you can leave them in. My strategy overall is to just leave all the relievers in my initial test build, see who I'm getting, and then do a little bit of this quality control here that Sheets mentioned of removing pitchers that I think are a little bit less likely than the simulator thinks are to pitch that night. But I know there's a few different ways to squeeze out a little bit of additional value here. Chris, do you do anything specific in your process of quality controlling your relievers?
Most of the time I tend to just kind of go with the exposures I end up with. One thing that I will do is look at the salaries for the different relievers, because sometimes there are pitchers that fall into either like the starter category or like the bulk category, and for whatever reason they are, priced differently but still have that projection in like 1 to 2 range. And for those people I will tend to exclude them, because then I feel like including those players lose some of the salary edge that using the min price relievers allows you. Another thing that I will do is in a slate where there are a lot of relievers projected and the pool is really, really large, I will raise the minimum projection to 1 just to try and like trim the field down and allow me to focus more on which ones, could actually, or are more likely, I should say, to get meaningful time in the game. Because when there are, 10 relievers that could possibly go in the game, that's a lot to go through and try and like weed out. But I think if you are going to spend the time researching relievers and looking at who you think is more likely to play and who is less likely to play, one way you can add a lot of value is to take the projection of those relievers that you are going to exclude and shift some of that projection to the relievers that you are more confident in, because that will allow you to leverage your research even more and get more lineups that take advantage of that opportunity that those players are likely to have.
Yeah, I think that's especially true if you're finding that you are getting a lot of access to a specific reliever in your lineups, and that guy did pitch the day before or maybe pitch 2 days prior, and you're thinking it's unlikely that guy gets in the game. The builder is giving you an indication that there's value on relievers in general. I think the most important thing that can happen here is the guys get in the game. I think that would be an interesting opportunity, instead of maybe just Xing that player out, to go back to your projections and see if you can maybe move his point projection to somebody else. A lot of these guys can generally be projected pretty similarly, but the point, and feel free to jump in here, Chris, if you disagree, but I feel like the point where you really start to see a lot of these guys pop is if they're projected over about 1.5 or so points, especially if you have that rare game where a reliever is projected for 2 or more points. That's a guy you're totally going to start to see in your lineups, at least in my experience here overall.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's going to, like we said earlier, that's going to tend to coincide with low total games or games with stud pitchers. So if you have those low totals and that ace pitching, and you also have those relievers that are projected for 1.5 to 2, maybe even above 2, like you're probably going to get pretty high exposure to them.
Absolutely. Cool. I think now is maybe a good opportunity here to talk about some strategies for some of these bigger slates, maybe some more advanced showdown strategy here. A lot of the traditional, say there's 15 games throughout the whole day and there's 6 showdowns throughout the day. A lot of those contests that you're going to find available are going to be in this kind of general range, maybe 100 to 10,000 entrants here. Maybe say you're playing a 20 max. You'll see that, again, what we're really allowing the sliders to do for us here is to use the optimals to be very gentle with our touch with correlation and ownership fade. And we're generating very closely to single game simulation optimal lineups for our builds, right? And we talked about what the value of that is. On a day like tomorrow, we are going to have some bigger contests. I think again on Sunday night. I know DraftKings has been running satellites for the final game of the Yankees and Red Sox series, which will be Sunday night. So I assume they're going to have some pretty big contests on Sunday too. I think our strategy needs to shift a little bit here when we're talking about these bigger contests where the emphasis on differentiation and leverage over the field gets a lot greater. I have a few thoughts to share on this, but Chris, I'll maybe give you the floor at first here to maybe talk about any strategies that you like to employ when you're talking about showdowns on a much bigger slate. Maybe something where there's, I don't know, how many entries are there in some of the contests tomorrow?
It looks like the largest one on DraftKings, 15,000 plus total entrants, 150 max.
Okay.
So you definitely, if you're serious about going for first, you're probably going to have to apply some strategy to force uniqueness or to differentiate yourself. I think the slate like tomorrow is what tends to get people's attention for Showdown and draws them in. But I think it also kind of like emphasizes the importance of contest selection because the variance in Showdown, especially if you are forcing that uniqueness to go for first, you're going to have a lot of slates where you just do really badly. But one of the advantages of there being so many is that you can just like deal with it and play the next one. Like I don't really care if I do really badly because I know that there are a lot of opportunities for me to make up for that. And over a large sample, I'm pretty confident in my results. But the slate like tomorrow, with that huge contest, I'm going to prioritize a lot of smaller things within my bankroll, and I'm probably not even going to get to that contest. And
Gotcha.
That's okay. But for people that are like looking for that sweat or that big score to get unique in that contest, there are definitely some more advanced things you can do, both in terms of like salary and relievers that we already covered, but you can even go as far as thinking about pinch hitters or pinch runners and who is likely to get in the game that is starting out and who is likely to get taken out of the game that is starting in. In the playoffs last year, that was something that came into consideration in a lot of those huge contests because teams were going through their bullpen and their position players so regularly that a lot of the time, the people that started in the order, by the time you got to the end of the game, there could be 2 or 3 different guys.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think especially in some of the playoff and World Series showdowns, you start to see those pinch hitters really start to jump up. Do you have any savvy strategies for picking pinch hitters or anything that ends up playing a role in your process of finding some of those guys that are opportunities for pinch hits?
I would maybe just look at the guys that tend to be favored versus like certain handedness pitcher. So if you have, like this is kind of an outdated example, but for instance, last year on the Dodgers, like Jock Peterson would tend to play or get pinch hit depending on the pitcher they were facing. And as they went through as they go through the innings, depending on like what happens, if the pitcher changes, he might get taken out of the game or put into the game. Just something like that. And it is a very risky approach, but it also increases your chances of uniqueness like tremendously. And so for these huge contests, that is a potential source of edge as long as you're willing to kind of like live with the risk and the variance. And for like last year in particular in the playoffs, I know a lot of the winning lineups had some sort of element that involved, pinch hitters.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah. So, I mean, some of that, I think, especially as we start talking about playoff ball and World Series ball, watching the game flow and getting an idea of how certain players are used, against other players is, I think, a really strong approach.
Yeah.
For a slate like tomorrow, where some of those contests are starting to get a little bit bigger, I think another strategy that can be employed, pulling back to our strategy session from 2 weeks ago, right? 5 strategies of winning DFS players, is starting to make some edits to the ownership projections as well. You'll see here that on, for example, that contest that Chris mentioned here, 150 max, 15,000 or so entrants, we do start to see ownership fade crop up here a little bit. And we've mentioned here on office hours before that anytime your ownership fade slider is starting to come up, or you're starting to use it more than maybe you do in your traditional play for that contest, it is a reflection of also how confident you are in the ownership projections overall. Something that Matt and Will mentioned 3 weeks ago now, I keep calling back to these great strategy sessions we've been having, is they mentioned that on some of these small slates, the way that we're building our ownership projections is running sometimes thousands of builds at very high smart diversity and just getting an idea of what optimal lineups can look like and what lineups that are very likely to be constructed look like, right? And in some ways, we do have an effect of, especially when you're getting down to very small slates, 2-gamers, showdowns, and things like that, there is a little bit of an effect of projecting ownership in the way that the simulator thinks is optimal as opposed to likely, right? Matt and Will talked a lot about how humans a lot of times are better at predicting human behavior than a computer is. If you've played MLB Showdowns before, one thing that will jump out very quickly to you is that the relief pitchers themselves are very rarely owned this high. I think Chapman maybe is probably the likeliest to be the highest owned reliever here on the slate, given that he is a pretty big name closer. I think his ownership projection is still a little high. I think the builder is indicating to us in some ways here that it finds that these ownership projections are actually what the field would do if they were optimally sharp. One thing that I think is really interesting, and I think one place this ownership actually tends to go, is back on the starting pitchers themselves. I think you can, especially as you start to play some MLB showdowns, you get an idea of how ownership starts to condense onto different positions where it isn't, which is sometimes on those relievers. You can make little changes to your ownership projections overall, and then start taking advantage of just using a bigger ownership fade slider to build lineups that have some leverage in the form of ownership fade in your lineups. So that could be as simple as maybe taking down your relievers to 1 or 2 points projected, or 2 percentage points of projected ownership, and keeping track of where some of this ownership came from and applying it to guys that you think are going to be popular. And maybe that's not just the starting pitchers, right? I don't want to give the indication that every single slate, the 2 starting pitchers are the most owned guys, because they're not. It's just a common trend I've seen. But maybe you're taking some of that leftover ownership from relievers and adding it onto the pitchers and some of these big bats, the other highly projected owned guys in the lineup, and allowing ownership fade to do some different things for you, as the sliders would indicate, right? It's, again, another strategy that Max mentioned that he really liked to do this on high variance sports like golf. MLB Showdown is definitely another one of those, right? Where we can take advantage of our intuition and our knowledge about where ownership's going to lie, use a higher ownership fade slider, and find an opportunity to get a little bit different there as well. So definitely something interesting there.
Yeah, I think like that's definitely where our ownership projections, they tend to err on the side of under projecting ownership for those recognizable, like, big name players that you expect to be chalky for people that are just building by hand, and like over projecting the ownership for those low projected players that still allow you to like make strong lineups. And for Showdown, that definitely means that we tend to over project relievers, I think, a little bit, and under project the starting pitchers. Like for a reliever in a standard showdown slate, anything over 5% ownership would be like very high. Mm-hmm. And on this slate, we currently have 2 people projected, pretty high above that. And so I think it would be reasonable to shift some of that ownership from those players towards the starting pitchers.
Yeah, totally agree. And you had mentioned too, about people by building by hand and what they're likely to do. DraftKings makes it very, very hard to find relievers when you're building by hand, right? You have to check a box that says, show me players that aren't starting. And it's just an extra step. It's something that I think the field, or especially the softer field, isn't likely to do or even to look at. I think that's part of the reason why the ownership on some of those players gets depressed, right? And our ownership values are... they equal out, the sum of the ownership values equal out to what they should, right? So if you take all the util spots, what is that? Five total spots. So theoretically, if you summed up all of the SS owned for all the util spots, you should get 500, and it will if you go out and do that. I think that's the right. It's 5 utility spots, right? It's 1 captain,
Correct.
6. Yeah. So it should equal 500%, right? So if you remove some of the ownership from some of these relievers, that ownership needs to go somewhere. And it, I think, can be best applied, again, like Chris said, to some of the guys that we're projecting to be the highest owned and bump up their ownership a little bit more, and then use ownership fade to find some opportunities to fade there. So, Chris, you had mentioned, I think we're getting to the last quarter of an hour here, but one thing you had mentioned just before, and I think I want to spend a little bit more time on it, is the contest selection component here, bankroll management. These contests are very variant. Can you talk a little bit more about what your strategy and approach is to contest selection here for MLB Showdowns?
Sure. So I totally just follow the rules laid out by Andy and his contest selection ideas that are part of the MLB course on our site. So I am just looking at effective entrants, trying to prioritize the contests with the highest effective entrants, and then also prioritizing lower buy-in contests, just to try and find that balance between softer fields and just the contests that take more people, max entrant to fill them. On the standard showdown slate, that means that there's usually a couple single entry contests that are sort of in that 500 to 100 entrant range, and then a couple 20 maxes that are sort of in that 500 to 2,000 range, depending on the slate. And so those are always my first priorities, because like I said, I am playing these slates consistently, looking to grind out a profit. I'm not looking to play only the big contests, looking for the huge score or for the big sweat. So I focus on those first with a conservative bankroll strategy, because they are so variant. And then another thing I look for is, especially in the contests, or the slates, I should say, where there are other things going on, either other sports, bigger contests, or maybe it's during the day where people are still at work or they have other stuff going on. It's not uncommon for these showdown slates to have significant overlay. And I'm not just talking about like the contests don't fill. I mean, like, they have more guaranteed prizes than there are entry fees from people playing them. And so when you find those situations, I will be more aggressive in those, and essentially play as many lineups as I think I can without going over that threshold. Because in those cases, as long as your lineups are average, then you're already plus EV. And so
Right.
if you're building contest winning lineups that have that potential, then that's a very a very strong place to focus your efforts. But those opportunities are, I think, more common in MLB Showdown than I see in any other of the popular sports.
Yeah, absolutely. I've noticed that too. I see it in particular with some of the day games. So if you have access to be able to set lineups during the day when people are at work and maybe don't have as many opportunities, I think there's a lot of overlay that comes into those games. I also have noticed it on the games that are not attached to a slate in general. If it's a day game and it's tucked in perfectly, like some of those 6:40 Eastern time start games sometimes don't show up on the afternoon slate or the early slate or the main slate. Sometimes those games, I think, just get lost in the shuffle and people don't always play the showdowns there. So there is a lot of overlay to be found. Yeah. I would, again, just stress the point overall here that use tomorrow's game as an opportunity if you haven't already been playing and you want to get into them to get into MLB Showdowns. But we definitely recommend making this a part of your kind of overall contest mix on a day-to-day basis, and playing from an approach of quantity, right? Play a small amount of your bankroll so that you can weather the swings in the right kinds of contests overall on as many showdowns as you can. The beauty of these is that even though on one given night you can lose all your entries, right? It's very easy to happen. It's showdown. It's very variant, but you may have another 5 games coming up tomorrow to play more showdowns. And in a lot of ways, you're going to not only be able to realize your edge much quicker, but also see opportunities for you to improve or to see whether your process is working very quickly. In a lot of ways, MLB Showdown is happening at like a rate 5 times as quickly as the MLB main slate season. And you can determine what you're doing right, what you're not doing right by looking at some of your past results much, much quicker. So highly recommend taking that approach. That's the approach that both Chris and I use here. We play a lot of showdowns. There's a lot of edge overall to be found here, just by using smart diversity overall, allowing the builder to do a lot of work for you. But then secondarily, using some of these strategies we've talked about to differentiate, find some overall leverage on the field, and build some winning lineups. So
yeah, I think if you have a long-term approach, realistic expectations, and just some patience, it's a great way to kind of like become, get good results, but also just become a better DFS player, because it does give you an opportunity to focus on process instead of results, because you do have so many samples. So you can really kind of think about, how am I going to design my approach towards these slates so that I'm trying to get a good outcome, but also using everyone as an opportunity to get better. Because if you can just consistently get better with all of these slates that are being offered in this format, there's a lot of upside.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in some ways, showdowns provide us an opportunity at a very micro level to see very basic forms of leverage and varying our roster construction, just because there's a limited number of players in the pool, right? We can see the clear form of leverage that playing relief pitchers gives us in these contests, or your example of using Voit at a lower salary and a similar ceiling to Judge at probably a lineup construction that's much lower owned. These concepts at a very micro scale are often very easy to see. There's opportunities to find these quickly. And I think you made a great point about how playing these often, partly just because you get the opportunity to play them so much more often, but playing these often really does give you an opportunity to level up the rest of your overall DFS play, your MLB DFS play, by seeing these opportunities at the macro level on a 12-game slate or a 15-game slate, once you've seen them often on the single-game slate. So
yep, totally agree. I think it definitely sort of exaggerates all of the elements that go into like DFS and decision making, and like thinking about ownership and projections and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see here. We are getting close to the end of time here. It's been a fairly quiet day overall on questions. Thank you, Sheets, for throwing a few into the ring here. With 6.5 minutes or so left, if anybody else has any questions about Baseball Showdown, fire them off. We've got a fun slate tomorrow. It should be, I know, maybe not the best overall contest selection mix for tomorrow, but it is always fun to have these contests with a little bit of a higher payout structure. Let's see. I did see a question come in here real quickly from Adam. He said, hey, guys, coming late. Sorry for late question. Does the simulation ever consider pinch hitters? Someone like Alex Dickerson on San Francisco, who never starts versus lefties, but usually pinch hits and ends up with as many at-bats for the starter that was replaced. I don't believe we account for pinch hitters at the moment in the baseball model. Chris, do you know the answer to that?
I'm pretty confident the answer is no. I think if you see, especially after lineups have been confirmed, the batters that are confirmed in the order will have a full allocation for their projection, and those that aren't should be projected at 0. So that can, like we were talking about earlier on these huge slates, if you're willing to take that risk and embrace kind of the variance, for the sake of the leverage on the field it can give you. That's a great way to apply some nuance and some baseball knowledge and expertise to your exposures. And you can, think about those players that are likely to get pinch hit and who you think is going to go in for them. And you can shift some of the projection from that player's full allocation to whoever you think is going to come in for them relative to the opportunity you expect them to get.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, Adam here, if you've got an edge or a read on a particular team or player, like you mentioned here with the Giants, even better, right? This is kind of almost the exact example we used before. Chris was talking about Jock Peterson and in the World Series last year, who tend to hit, what was it, typically more right-handed hitters and get pinch hit in those situations often. Yeah, something like that, right? So that's the exact perfect situation to do something like this. I think you could even hedge by giving that player maybe a projection of like 4 or half of what you might expect that player's full game projection to be. Mm-hmm. At that point, they're likely, maybe depending on salary, to start trickling into lineups at a more reasonable exposure than showing up all of a sudden in 50% of your lineups or something like that.
Yeah, you could get them kind of at a similar rate that you might see for like the average reliever. And if you're comfortable with that, then that is a way that you're going to get a lot of those lineups are pretty likely to be unique or at least duplicated very few times. But again, it's a trade-off. Like you're definitely sacrificing average performance and average projection for that upside. And like that's okay as long as you're conscious of that decision.
Right. Cool. Let's see. Another question here. Any different strategies between DK and FanDuel? Haven't talked too much about FanDuel here today. I don't typically play too many of these contests here on FanDuel. Chris, are these part of your contest strategy mix overall?
They are not. So I cannot really contribute anything to that, the differentiation. I think with their pricing system, combined with smart diversity, you probably have to do fewer things to force unique lineups. But that's kind of just my intuition, and that could be wrong.
Yeah, I go back and forth on how much edge I feel like there is on FanDuel's model here for a few reasons. One, no pitchers at all. No starting or relievers. Also, you don't pay additional salary to roster players at the multiplier positions. I think that instead of having this effect of kind of condensing the ceilings and giving you more optimal players at the multiplier positions, I think it gives you less. I would say explore the percentiles a bit here. Look at percentiles that coincide with the win conditions of these lineups, right? 85th type percentile outcomes. And generally notice the similarity between the ceilings of a variety of players, right? You see there are, 6 players that are all very close to probably the same ceiling. We see a slight edge to Judge, but some of that is probably a little bit of noise. I think in general, I would expect the field to undervalue and under project the overall ceiling potential of certain players, right? I think guys like Judge and Stanton and the biggest names, especially on teams. I mean, the Red Sox and Yankees obviously have a lot of names on both their rosters, but especially on some of these other games where there's maybe only a handful of names that the average player is even like to really gravitate towards. These ceilings are all really close. I would say on FanDuel, I think Chris nailed it. I would play with percentiles to look at some of these ceilings and then really allow the builder to do a lot of this work for you. Explore what optimal lineups look like. If we run just a very quick test one here, right on the edge of let's run something like this. Right here up against the end of our show here today, I wouldn't be surprised to see extremely diverse MVP and star pools because the builder is likely to recognize how close the ceilings are of all these different players in the batting order. Yeah,
I think with their multiplier system, just by the way that they have players scored, like you're going to have more unique combinations just because of you can use the same players and create multiple unique lineups, more so than in DraftKings where you just have one captain spot. And because of that, you probably don't need to go as far in terms of seeking out uniqueness. I think you could still apply some of those same strategies on the larger contests. But for the typical slate, that's probably not necessary.
For sure. Yeah. All right, guys. Well, we are right up against the end of our show here today. Thank you for tuning in, whether you watched us live here or you are watching the recording after the fact. Thank you for giving us your attention for an hour here. Enjoy the slate tomorrow. It should be a lot of fun. Baseball here is finally back. It's been a long 3 days. I will, of course, be back on office hours here again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. So you will have one more opportunity to fire off any questions at me tomorrow. If you watch this recording back, or maybe you think of something later tonight that you wanted to ask in the show, didn't get an opportunity to, I am happy to tackle those questions tomorrow in office hours, or questions about whatever else you guys want to talk about. We will be probably wrapping up or through round 1 of the Open Championship for golf. So I fully expect to already be tilting some of my lineups on stream tomorrow. But we will go ahead and see you guys tomorrow. Back again for a strategy session again next week. Thank you all for joining the stream. Chris, thanks for being here today. It was a lot of fun, and we'll see you guys later.
Bye.